I don't mind losing an opportunity if I've got a chance to play the game fairly,
Right.
an even playing field. But when you're witnessing opportunities that are coming about, you're not even invited to the game.
Welcome, Jason Thompson, to the Breaking Show today.
Like what?
It's great to have you here sharing this journey of how a young Indigenous boy starts off within the family life on a reservation, experiences a small town, experiences the growth into larger cities, experiences all of the challenges along the way that an Indigenous young man faces frustration, not being invited to the game, and perseveres, hangs in there, and chooses conversation and relationship over conflict. And not only does that for himself, but is now also advocating for that for so many people. So thank you for coming today and sharing that.
So, unique thing about my community is if you're driving coast to coast across Canada,
Okay.
you have to cross our community. You have to go through our community.
Because you got
There's no bypassing if you're traveling by land across Canada without going through our community. So the junction is Highway 1117, and yeah, that's the only way across. So it's interesting. Like about 15 years ago or so, roughly maybe less, they built a new bridge.
Okay.
It was a cable stay bridge, and the first evening that the temperature dropped below -30, the cables contracted and lifted the bridge about 1.5 feet, 2 feet on one side, on the west side of the bridge. Basically crippled and stopped traffic flowing through Canada for days.
Wow.
And I actually worked for a construction company at the time that helped with that repair, because our company that I was working for actually worked on a similar type problem in San Francisco.
Yeah, there was a problem like that. I don't know how many years ago, similar to that, where there was a bridge, on the way to Niagara Falls from here, that had a similar thing. And obviously, in that case, I think that there was an alternative, right?
Yeah.
For that, that's like the only pass.
There's an alternative for us, but it's through the bush.
Yeah.
And you ain't driving semi tractor trailer through those.
So can I ask you, like, Jason, like when you were born you say on a reserve. Okay, I'm an immigrant.
Yeah.
I guess everyone's an immigrant who's not, right? So, but I came here in the 80s, so way later.
Yeah.
But when I grew up, and this is why I'm so excited to sit with you, because I have never sat like this, with, like, to me, another fellow, like an Indigenous Canadian, to sit down and really try to understand and hear the origin story of the boy, and so when you were born, I wanna understand on a reserve, life on the reserve when you're born. What's that like? You're born. You're help me understand. Like how is that any different? Or
Growing up, I guess I never really noticed any difference. I guess the unique thing between the close proximity to the town of Nipigon relative to the reserve was,
because other people say I was born in the city,
yeah,
the town,
yeah,
the village even.
yeah,
But you say I was born on a reserve.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a difference.
There's a difference, again, and you don't really notice it at an early age.
Right.
It's just your place where you live. You grew up, your friends are there. It's no different than anybody
Go to
else.
school and
Yeah, 100%. We went to school in the town of Nipigon, so there's always been integration, right? Like Nipigon, when I grew up there, was probably about 2,500 people roughly. We had a plywood mill operating in the region, and the neighboring town of Red Rock had a pulp and paper mill. So the community itself was flourishing. There was, a lot of opportunities, opportunities like relative to a small town.
right. But you still see, like, you still use the word, like there was a lot of integration.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that word.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you say now looking back.
Yeah.
But as a child growing up, you already at some point in time you realize I'm living on a reserve and I'm going to the town
Yep.
to school.
Yep. Yeah.
Is that like that's how you understood it?
Yeah, 100%. So, I guess the difference between, I'll put this into this context, like growing up in the town, growing up on the reserve, but being deeply entrenched within the town of Nipigon,
Right.
there was just a lot of back and forth and working together. So never really experienced a lot of racism to that regard within the town of Nipigon.
Yeah, I'm not.
Um,
I'm thinking like, so. For example, like when I was a kid, and that's my time to go to school.
yeah,
I just went to the neighborhood school.
yeah,
It was in the same neighborhood. It was
yeah,
the same community.
yeah,
But as an indigenous person, when we're born, we're saying you're born on a reserve.
yeah,
You're saying I went into the town.
yeah,
I'm not worried about I'm not thinking racism. I'm just thinking the very beginnings of the thought of I'm here in this place,
yeah,
and that's a separate
yeah,
place. Even if I was like, for example, I remember, for example, small thing.
yeah,
I lived in North York,
yeah,
and I went to junior high in East York.
yeah,
It was a different place.
yeah,
So there's a different place.
yeah, yeah,
But it was not North York.
yeah.
So like, but is that the same feeling?
Uh,
Reserve to town, Indian to an integrated, or
no,
and you just brought up racism, so there's a different race. Help
it's
me understand that. I really want to understand it.
yeah, it's different in regards to just the political climate
Okay.
within the community, like within the reservation
At
in the
6 years
town of
old, you're
Nipigon.
thinking politics.
Oh, 100%, because
Really?
it's very prominent, and I think it's what allowed me to shape my future and my vision for the future as to where I want to be when I
Right.
grow up, right? And really, I think I clued in at an early age relative to the barriers that we face and started asking questions at an early age. Like I just and for me, through the integration within the town of Nipigon, a lot of my friends are Indigenous, non-Indigenous,
Right.
didn't really matter, right? But my reference to the racism was being in sports and in a small community. When you're young, you played within your community. You didn't travel around. But as you got older in sports, we had to go to Thunder Bay to play hockey.
That's the bigger.
And that's where you start getting exposed to the racism. You never really had it back home in Nipigon. Like, I mean, I think the community itself really embraced the fact that we were like sister communities. We worked together. We were a huge contributor to the town of Nipigon, the
Yeah.
local economy.
But
Our
when
people
I went
worked
to
there.
school in East York, nobody said you're from North York.
Yeah, yeah,
Like that wasn't that type
yeah.
of differentiation
But there is,
of one.
there
But
is.
that's not racism.
No.
Like you're from North York, but
Yep.
when you're from a reserve,
Yep.
right, going to a town,
Yep.
there's that sense of difference, right?
And I think it's
And it's
different.
not always celebrated. It's
Exactly.
actually
Exactly. So you see that, like I said, we've never really experienced that in Nipigon. There's been hints of it for sure. Don't get me wrong.
right.
But I mean, the communities, because I think it's because of the geographical location that it just, again, there was a lot of folks from our community that, met and had relationships with a lot of non-Indigenous folks from the town. Like it was really quite blended in that regard,
Right.
right? But I think that, when you look at other communities that are not in that position, that are not close, like a lot of the remotes, you see a lot more conversation around that disparity between the two, right? And I think the limiting factor that we see oftentimes within our communities and in our reserves is the fact that there is a lack of opportunity, right? And that for me was quite evident early on that, we're bound by the Indian Act, which is problematic for the most part relative to, as an example, through the Indian Act.
Do you mind if before we get into like the
Yeah.
Indian Act,
Yeah.
because I here's what I'm curious about.
Yeah.
For example, if I'm a kid,
Yeah.
I'm trying to put myself there. It's not like you got along with everybody on the reserve. You had boys that maybe bullied,
Yeah.
or I don't know, maybe it doesn't happen,
Yeah.
but
Oh,
a bigger guy and a smaller guy bump into each other, and the little guy feels like I'm being bullied, right?
Yep. Yep.
But this is a person on the reserve who's bullying me.
Yeah.
It can happen.
It happens.
Oh, it does happen.
happens.
Okay, so
It happens.
something like that is like it's something that's natural. It happens. Bigger guy, smaller guy.
Yeah.
Okay. But when somebody on the reserve you would bump into, there's a feeling.
Yep.
and that guy's kind of pushing you around,
Yep.
that's a person on a reserve doing it.
Yep.
But when there's somebody else who's not indigenous,
Yep.
who's pushing you around for another reason,
Yep.
that's a different feeling.
100%.
But to me, they're all someone's pushing you around.
100%.
So I first just wanted to I wanted to stay there a little longer because I feel like when an indigenous person is growing up, something that we don't often understand, I feel, or appreciate,
Yep.
or give enough, value to, is really how early on in a child's life, in a person's life, an indigenous person's life, it starts. For a lot of us who are not indigenous, who are not going through that experience, everything's like, what? It's kind of like, I'm just walking through my neighborhood.
Yeah.
This person who pushed me because they were bigger,
Yeah.
not because of another reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or said something nasty to me because I'm poor maybe and they're rich.
Yep.
It wasn't because of another reason.
Yep.
So a lot, we grow up, and at the same time, when I remember, if I ever met somebody who was not like me, my parents would simply just say, "Yeah, there's another country,
Yep.
and they're from that country."
Yep.
Oh, okay, and that was it.
Yep.
And okay, now go keep. We still kicked the same ball,
Yeah.
and we still got into the same fights. We still disagreed on the score.
Yep.
Some guy called it out of bounds, and some guy wasn't. It wasn't out of bounds. We all wanted to win, and kids.
Yep.
But that's not it. How the feeling is. I imagine then.
Yeah.
So from early days, you're on this reserve, and you are the original Canadian, and you somehow experience this from the very, very beginning, from very, very early on. And I imagine the intensity of that was very, very different. So that's what I'm really trying to experience through you, is that how
You got to understand that, understanding and not quite realizing
I don't understand politics when I'm 7, right? Nor do you.
No,
So
but
what was it?
You can understand from the even the difference, right? In as to, the non-Indigenous population to the Indigenous population. You never really could understand it, but there was always something internally probing you as to why.
Yeah.
Right. So as a people, listening to my dad tell his stories, we were very nomadic people.
Okay.
Right. They traveled the lakes to harvest food, berries, you name it. That's what we did. We would travel. We would follow the migration of the animals in the season.
You would.
Oh yeah, 100%. Many Indigenous people did that. I grew up, if you look at, things from this perspective, we were practicing apprenticeship and mentoring before it got titled apprenticeship and mentoring.
Sure.
Right? We were doing that. Whether it's hunting, fishing, trapping,
Right.
you name it. We've done it. I've done it since I was a kid.
It's a timeless principle.
100%.
Yeah.
Right? So then when, the settlers arrived and things started moving forward and we got bound to a reservation,
Okay.
that's where things changed.
Okay.
Right? We were very nomadic people, and we're still finding, remains from settlements, because that's just who we were as people.
So is it fair to say, am I understanding this right, that when as a young child growing up on a reservation, the stories and the experiences, either those experiences that you're going through, those are wonderful experiences, by the way.
100%.
That must be amazing.
100%.
Going out with the elders, I've only seen stuff like that maybe in a movie or read about it in a book.
Yeah.
But to actually walk like that must be amazing. What a thrill! What an experience!
100%.
But you talked about being bound on a reservation. You just said it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this acknowledgement that it's being bound on a
100%.
reservation,
100%.
and that there is a somehow a something got usurped. We're put here, and this is now a limitation.
100%.
And since you're a child, you're hearing this, or you're feeling it.
Yeah, you're feeling it. And honestly, again, through the history of colonization,
Yeah.
and it's not just Indigenous people to North America,
Right.
it's across the world.
Sure.
Right? But the history of colonization, those effects on colonization, have impacted every Indigenous group across the world, and it still continues to do that. And it continues, and you can see it now that you're more aware of the implications of that. I'm a lot more conscious to it now.
Yeah.
And as an example, right, like listening to, my parents' thought process and how they lived their life and how they lived their life, right, and raised us as kids,
Right.
has become very conscious
They're
to
still
me.
doing it. There's
They're
still
still
reservations.
there.
They're still thriving.
Oh, 100%,
Right.
100%. But we're also through this, through the history of colonization and dealing with the effects of the residential school, Indian day school, 60s scoop, right? Those effects are still prevalent today.
When you started to, as you grew up and you start with that feeling,
Mm-hmm.
and at first this feeling is like, okay, there it is.
Yeah.
I remember feelings like that.
Yeah.
Not maybe to the level that you felt it.
Yeah.
Now growing up like that, and then as you said, you're now in this town where you kind of sing it a little bit, but it's,
Mm-hmm.
and then you go to the bigger cities,
Yeah.
and then now it's like in your face. It's like the extent to which sometimes it's very cruel, very cruel. What point in time, or did it ever happen to you that you're looking at yourself almost feeling sorry for yourself, like why is this happening to me, and like that like almost feeling like victimized, let's just say.
Yeah.
When did that start? Did it happen, and
It,
when did it start happening? How was that?
I don't know if it ever became to a point where I felt victimized for myself,
Okay.
because I've always been a very confident and assertive person.
Okay.
However, looking back at friends, families, colleagues, and complete strangers,
Right.
and sitting there going and realizing how they've lost their voice. And
So
it
for
was
you, Jason, you're telling me, I mean, I know you're a strong dude. You are.
yeah.
I respect you a lot. We've had great conversation, and we met like in politics, actually, at a conference, right?
Yeah.
And I will not forget the day we met, and I loved it. But you're telling me, like a young boy didn't feel some level of like weakness as a result of this constant, like, you know, you didn't.
No, I'm not saying that as a young person, 100%.
Yeah.
Right. I'll tell you honestly, there's were days and nights in my youth where, I spent time trying to scrub the brown off my knuckles, sitting there going, why am I
Really?
different? 100%. Right. And wondering if there was a reason why. As an example, like my parents grew up and we weren't wealthy. We didn't have and have gone without a lot of times, right? Never held that against my parents. I remember having to skip sporting events, not even playing hockey one year because my parents couldn't afford it. But you were also, kind of embarrassed to some degree that you didn't want to say anything to anybody. I can tell you honestly, like when I was probably about 13, 14 years old, my parents couldn't afford to put me in hockey one year. I love hockey.
Yeah.
And so I go out skating at the outdoor rinks. When I had a couple of bucks, I'd go skate with some of the other folks in town. And I remember one of the parents from our hockey team, my buddy's dad, was like, Jay, how come you're not playing hockey? How come you're not playing on a team?
Yeah.
I said, like, my parents couldn't afford it.
Wow.
He's like, what? He's like, yeah, I'm out skating. He goes, okay. That's all he said to me. He's like, okay. Next day I get a phone call and my parents come and talk to me. Okay, you're on the team. I don't know how it happened, but you're on the team.
Wow.
And but that you've gone without. And I
So
never
there's kindness that also comes from the greater humanity that's out there.
100%.
But that's interesting that a person who's Indigenous, who grows up going, hey, this is my land, this is my country, wants to not be that.
And I think a lot of that, kind of came from the fact that my dad, who's a great man.
Yeah.
He's a very quiet man, and he's not one to rock the boat, right? Very smart,
Deep and wise.
100%. And
Right.
with him, growing up, he was, he had a graded education, right? He attended Indian day school. But what I've kind of picked up on early on was that he was very much a person who was deep in the practicing of traditional ways relative to hunting, fishing, trapping.
Okay.
Still does that to this day, but had lost our culture, the traditional culture in regards to practicing ceremony and all that, and even sharing the language. Like never really shared the language with us as I got two younger brothers, and up until when my grandmother passed away, I could speak the language. I was 7, 8 years old. I lost the language. And my dad, I think to some degree through his teachings and learning and being told early on that, you don't practice your language, right? You basically, even though we never attended residential school, it was something that, sunk in deep with him that he has to basically get in alignment with what the rest of mainstream society wanted, right? So that had an impact, although we, again, picked up some great school skills along the way, but it was that traditional uh, aspect of things, including the loss of language,
Right.
that is still deeply troubling, right? And you know what, I can honestly tell you that even through the conversations I've had with my parents, and still do to this day,
Right.
help them try to understand, because what's becoming quite prevalent is the fact that they buried so much. They buried so much, and really tried to forget a lot
In order to keep the peace.
to keep the peace 100%,
Right.
right? So that's the challenge.
So it's interesting now that as a young man, you're growing up. You just like you really like it really hit here when you're like talking about scrubbing your knuckles, man.
Mm-hmm. I never told my wife that story till about 3, 4 years ago.
This is when you're a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people go through phases where, they're getting in touch with their identity. They're going through an identity crisis. It happens. It's adolescence, man, also. But that wasn't adolescence, man. That's something different.
Yep.
And so as you're in that now state,
Yep.
that's what I want to understand, because there you are. You don't want to be Indigenous. You don't want to be you're not Indian. You all of those terms, right? That
Yep.
I still have yet to fully understand and appreciate. But you don't want to be that, and you are. So then from there, I mean, please don't fast forward on this. I want to really understand. You go through life now not wanting to be this.
Mm-hmm.
What is a person who doesn't want to be that, other than trying to scrub the knuckles off? What else were you starting to think or say or do or behave like so that you're not Indigenous? Or was there anything else?
I don't think, honestly,
Because you think that's like,
yeah, it wasn't the fact
like
that,
I sometimes I get like, my name's Mohammed.
yeah,
I started going around calling myself Mo.
yeah,
Changing the name.
yeah,
Changing like clothing, changing language.
yeah.
Were you feeling that as well? Like, change my something?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I didn't believe the scraping of the color off my knuckles was that I didn't want to be Indigenous. I've always been very proud of my Indigenous culture. It was the color aspect of it.
Got it.
I was always a very dark person, right? In a community that wasn't very dark,
Okay.
right?
Oh,
So,
okay.
to me, that was a bit of a barrier and a challenge.
Okay.
But, again, I think at the end of the day, though, it was always being proud of the fact that, I've always had a good group of friends and colleagues. Didn't matter. Indigenous, non-Indigenous. I grew up with my cousins. So if you're talking about the reservation and spending time and growing up on the res, my cousins oftentimes, for the most part, there's a lot of relatives within the res,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like I can tell you right now, the leadership within the res right now, they're all my relatives.
Right.
So that's just a part of growing up. Like these like we were pretty much mostly all related in some degree.
Okay.
So I grew up with my cousins, and we still have that really strong bond today, right? And honestly, growing up like that, we practiced a lot, even as young men and women growing up on the res, that we often practice and often imitated what we seen growing up. So I remember me and my cousins, we would grab our fishing rods, we'd go fish in Nipigon River, we would sit in the side of a river bend and make tea and cook wieners and I guess imitating what our parents were doing. But one of the things that was always quite evident for me, and I picked this up at an early age, was the fact that there was probably, when I grew up on the res, when I was young, there was maybe 75 households within the res.
Okay.
Doubled that by now, tripled that probably by now. But what I picked up early on was there was not a lot of people that actually went off reserve to work, right? There was a handful of families that actually had one or both members of their family that actually went off to work. And
Why
like,
is that?
um,
Why do you
again,
think
I
that
think
was?
it's
Like when you were there, why was
I think honestly that this whole reservation mentality and this thought that was passed on through the time was that you're on the res, you stay on the res, right?
and it's the thing, like it's not a good thing to leave the res? Is
100%.
that, am I understanding that?
Yeah, 100%.
Really?
For some people's perspective, yes, I could say
Okay.
that's there's unfortunately to some degree even in 2025 that there's this on reserve off reserve
Okay.
type of challenge that's still we still face,
Okay.
right? And it's improving for sure, but there's no doubt about it, it's still there.
What would be, again, to understand those who say stay on the res, there must be a merit to their perspective. What are they thinking to stay on the res means to to keep on building this culture, to keep the culture intact? Yeah, and that it would be a compromise or a loss of culture, or to leave. Is that how it's kind of is?
Yeah, I think so. And what we deal with to some degree, again, unfortunately,
Like when my kid want to go to school, I'm
yeah,
like, go wherever you got to go learn.
yeah,
And if you got to stay out there, then the world's your oyster, you know,
yeah,
versus the reservation, stay on the reservation. So I
yeah.
want to understand that.
Well, it's a safe haven,
Okay.
right? So, I'm not sure how familiar you are with, some of the travesties that have been going on in Thunder Bay. So I'll use this example. So Northern Ontario, oftentimes in our communities, a lot of our communities actually don't have secondary institutions, first of all. So you got to leave community to go to attend a secondary
Okay.
institution.
Right.
But if you get a chance to, and I may misquote this, but there's Seven Fallen Feathers is a book out there, and it's basically a story on seven Indigenous youth who traveled to the city of Thunder Bay to attend a secondary school, and basically lost their lives. That wasn't properly investigated. So that having those instances and incidents
So there's a
happen,
safety. Okay.
it's that safety aspect of it,
Okay.
right? Where people have faced discrimination. Again, just recently in Thunder Bay, the last 5 years, two young sisters were walking down the street, and a non-Indigenous gentleman, threw a tow hitch, a trailer hitch, hit one of the ladies in the stomach, and she ended up losing her life as a result of that. And unfortunately, it's still very prominent in 2025. So I think the res has always been a safe haven, even for my parents. Like my wife and I, been married 28 years, been with my wife since high school. And, we've always been ones that, we want to travel the world. I want to see the world. I want to see, what's going on. But, I remember early on when we started doing a lot of this, my mother, I love her to death, but she was always very much, you're going to get hurt. Something's going to happen.
So there's this voice of beyond the borders, the
Yep.
bounds of this reservation.
Yeah.
There, it's not safe.
Yeah.
Yet on the other hand, there's also being bounded into a reservation.
Yeah.
Okay, I
And
see.
you know what? And you can understand this because I don't think at the time people were putting into context exactly what was happening relative to the residential school, the 60s scoop, and what was happening. They knew there was something going on, right? So as an example, my father shared the story with me, but he didn't share it with me until I was in my mid-20s.
Okay.
And we were attending an event in Red Lake. I was working up in Ear Falls, and Red Lake's an hour past Ear Falls, north of Ear Falls. And we were attending the Norseman Festival. And my parents came up to visit for the weekend. And my dad, I guess he's a very, very quiet man. And we were talking, and he's like, Jay, he goes, you know what? He goes, it's interesting how they celebrate the Norseman Plain here. He says, I understand why they do it. It was vital for supplies to the community. Red Lake's a large gold mining town. still is to this day. He says, but when I was a kid, he says, and we were growing up around the lakes and around Lake Nipigon, he said, when we heard a plane coming in, a Norseman plane coming in, my parents told me and my two older sisters, you guys run and hide deep in the bush. You stay there until we come get you, because these are the bad guys coming to take you away, right? So imagine in that context, at a very young age, that you were told by your parents, go hide, run and hide, because somebody's coming to take you away, right? And even growing up, you know, on the res and hearing these threats from it was mainly my mom. She was the disciplinarian within our family, and she would smarten up. They're going to send you away to boarding schools. What she would always say. It wasn't until recently that I realized it wasn't a boarding school. It was the residential schools, and then there's a lot of stories that were shared that we're picking up on right now. And as an example, my mother told me a story, from her childhood where, you know, her dad and mother had separated, and they basically gave the kids the option. You either stay with her father or go with the mother. And at the time, the majority of her siblings decided to stay with her dad. And Children Aid Services tried to go and apprehend my mother and her siblings, right? Just because they deemed that my grandfather was unfit to raise his kids. No rhyme or reason. That was, again, so that reserve and that, basically my grandfather chased him off the reserve. But that in context to allowed that feeling and that feeling of a safe haven within the reservation, right? This is our place.
You know, we use the word free
Mm-hmm.
pretty loosely out there. And, today we talk about Canada being a place where, it's one of the most sought after passports in the world. People want to come to Canada. And because of how great it is over here. And then to hear you talk about, here in Canada, people of Canada having to experience this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, travesty is a word to
100%.
think about. That because I can tell you, I grew up, spent part of my life in a country where the same thing we would worry about, living in fear that at any time somebody could come and take you away.
Mm-hmm.
But that happened here in Canada,
100%.
and it happens here in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And that to grow up with this as a starting point, like, what does that do? Where does that put you, right? Like, here as a starting point.
100%.
Now that's where you were starting, and then you went through, what you talked about as a teenager. Now you're at 20. Now, you went out there, and you came off the reservation to go study.
Yep.
Did you?
Yep.
And so, so now you went to go study. Where did you go study?
I went to school I studied in Thunder Bay at Confederation College.
Okay, so
And
post-secondary.
Post-secondary, yeah.
Pursued
So the human resource management program. I've always been, a person that believed in the human asset,
Yeah.
right? People intrigue me. Always have, always will,
Yeah.
right?
I don't even like calling them asset. Honestly, like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I think that's but I get what you mean. Like,
Yeah.
I same here. I love the human being, right? So, when you were on your way there to college, it's not like everybody does that.
No.
Right? And so again, you're now not like everybody, and now not like everybody on the reserve.
Yeah.
What's that like?
It's interesting, but we've always felt a level of support.
Okay.
My parents have always been strong supporters, and I
That's
joke about
huge.
this. I say this jokingly, but it's true. Like, my parents never had a lot, but they always made sure we had something in our belly when we were going out. And my mom always made sure we were going to school, me and my two brothers, and whether it be just simply toast and tea or whatever the case may be. So,
Well, having parents like that is a lot.
100%,
Right? Like,
100%.
that's a form of wealth.
Actually, I find my roots, and that when I need that space to feel connected again, I go back and I sit and have toast and tea. I had toast and tea this morning before I came here.
Nice.
But it is of that, And I'm very proud to say that although back when I was younger, we didn't have a lot of post-secondary graduates or people attending post-secondary education, but I'm very proud to say that from our community's perspective, that's definitely not the case anymore.
Good.
We have, um, we have engineers, we have technicians, we have doctors,
Right.
lawyers,
Now,
from our
but back
communities.
then when you were going, that wasn't the
No,
norm. And
not,
so like
not.
that's what I'm trying to understand for you
Yep,
specifically, Jason,
yep,
like you're not the norm
yep,
on both on the reservation and off the reservation.
yep,
That's the minority of a minority.
yep,
And so when you're going out there, you're studying, you're facing the same challenges, right?
yep,
Now, but when you go there, it happens to everybody, I feel. You grow now, like your mental strength starts growing.
100%.
You've got the spirit already.
Yeah,
You got the spirit, but now with the spirit and your physique and your body,
yeah,
you're into football and you're a strong guy, young man. Yeah, man, you're prime. You can
yeah.
get into your prime now. Um, so now what? After you feel, and it's interesting. You said you went to go study, about human resources
Yeah.
because that was like your passion. So now you're armed, you're equipped with knowledge. You've got your spirit, you got your body strength, you got your mind strength.
Yeah.
What was your plan?
Honestly, growing up on the reservation and in a small community in Nipigon, never really truly understood the opportunities that this world presented
Hmm.
had to present. Right. I never really realized what type of opportunities there were out there, and I think that's still a bit of a barrier out there right now for a lot of Indigenous folks.
But for you, you said earlier that you had gone to Thunder Bay
Yeah.
and you saw Thunder Bay.
Yeah.
You had seen other cities.
Yeah.
How far was your the radius from the reservation that you feel that you went when you were younger?
Growing up, it was probably the North Shore within 200, 300, maybe 400-kilometer radius,
Right.
right? I still remember as a young man traveling down to Minnesota with my dad.
That was at what age?
I was probably about 12, 13, 14 years old.
So naturally, because you don't go that far, you don't
Yeah.
see.
No.
But in spite of that, what was so I understand now the context of the plan now
Yeah.
you're about to tell me.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, you had a plan, or what did
To some
were you
degree,
thinking?
it was just going in with
what were you going
these,
to do next?
well, going back, like I was very fortunate growing up that, within the town of Nipigon and it being such a close-knit community that, I was 17 years old, and as soon as I turned 17 years old, my old hockey coach told me, he says, Jace, as soon as you turn 17, he goes, you come and drop off an application to the local plywood mill. He says, I'll give you student work. So I started working there as a student, ended up working there full-time after I went to college for a year.
This is on the reservation.
This is just in the town of Nipigon.
Nipigon.
Yeah.
Got it.
So it was during that time when I was working at the mill full-time that the mill actually, because it was locally owned, it got purchased out by a large forestry company called Weyerhaeuser. And it was that during that change and that acquisition by Weyerhaeuser of Multiply that all of a sudden all these job postings start coming out. And it wasn't even in my initial time at college where I seen the opportunity. It was actually through the acquisition of the plywood mill from Weyerhaeuser of Multiply from Weyerhaeuser. Then they start putting all these job postings out, and I'm started looking like, what's this? What is a human resource person? That really was what opened my eyes to things, right? And then it really kickstarted my eagerness to understand, the world in general. And it was through that time where I bid on a human resource or a developmental supervisory position, and that really kickstarted my journey around understanding human resources and business. So I was very fortunate. I was selected to be a part of this supervisor development program, and I went to a sawmill in Near Falls, and the mill at the time was called a high performance. They practiced a high performance work system where we did weekly meetings around KPIs within the company. And that was my first real introduction, and it really, got me hungry for more understanding the world of business, world of opportunity, um, and exposed me to all these different careers. And then for me, I always try to tie it back to my community and the First Nations to do. And like, okay, well, how do we prosper from this?
Oh,
How do we
you're a guy who
grow?
always wants to share.
Oh, 100%.
And that's I mean, that's what I find is awesome about you. And that's why you're always out there. You're advocating to be able to bring those opportunities to people who don't get those
Mhm.
opportunities, who if they got those opportunities, not only would it be good for them, the others would benefit from their labor, from their contribution
100%.
to the economy. So the win is on both sides,
100%.
on all sides. So I think that's great work that you do. But now, as you're going through that, that growth now in the world of business or corporate, whatever you want to call it, are you at that point in time thinking, I'm Indigenous? Are you thinking to yourself, or are the thoughts, or are the experiences of, oh man, here's like where I'm noticing this boundary, I'm noticing this ceiling,
Mhm.
I'm noticing this inequity. Are you seeing that along the line?
Yeah, 100%. It's always been quite evident, and the barriers remain. So, as an example, like before I arrived here today, I was on a conference call with some friends and colleagues where we're doing a study relative to the economic contribution from Indigenous organizations, businesses, and communities to the city of Thunder Bay. And when we talk about that, it's a celebration of like, you know, when people actually get a chance to see the report, hear the report, read the report, they're going to be blown away by the impact and contribution to the city of Thunder Bay. And we're very proud to celebrate that. But we're also going to deliver the message, and what we're delivering the message is around the fact that we're achieving these successes while still facing many barriers, and challenges. Right?
Give me an example of a barrier that you experienced early on
It's
when you were a kid. Like, help me understand.
there's ultimately, well, let's face it, the old boys club is still alive and well in many instances.
Like, a lot of people get passed up
Yeah,
from a promotion,
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
reasons. It's
yeah.
cronyism, whatever
There,
you want
there's
to call
there's a
it.
lot. Like
You
there's
know?
so many, right?
Yeah.
Like, so you look at
But
it.
what made you feel or think that it was because you were Indigenous?
Well, I think again, it's probably that conversation around the have and have nots, right? It's quite evident when you don't even get asked to participate in an opportunity. I don't mind losing an opportunity if I've got a chance to play the game fairly on
Right.
an even playing field.
Right.
But when you're witnessing opportunities that are coming about, you're not even invited to the game. There's something there, right? And that becomes quite evident. And right now, what we're also facing, those who work in the Indigenous business realm, you hear the talk of reconciliation this, reconciliation that. And unfortunately, what we're running into is a lot of, they call them the pretendian people are, identifying as Indigenous or not truly
Pretending. I just
truly
got what you
Indigenous.
just said.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a term. I never heard
It
that one
happens a
before.
lot, and
Okay.
honestly, unfortunately, like, our governments are dealing with it right now, right? And they're scaling back on a lot of this. They're trying to do the right thing. I get it, but unfortunately, the folks that are choosing and wanting to not be open and transparent and honest are finding ways around it.
So, I get what you're saying there
Yeah,
about not being invited to the game,
yeah.
and you're capable. So
Mm-hmm.
why wouldn't you get the invitation, right? And
100%.
you got to ask the question, right? Like, hey, hold on a second. Is it
Yeah,
because they just wanted somebody, whoever it was, wanted their nephew to get the job, and you could have been any color, you could have
yep,
been any
yep,
origin.
yep,
It's just because it was more
yep,
nepotism
yep,
than racism.
yep.
That might be the excuse,
Potential.
I think, or the
Yep,
response that can come back.
yep,
However, the reality for you though is,
yep,
yeah, hold on, I did get passed up, and hey, look, is that a coincidence?
yep,
You know, and if it happens once, it's one thing,
yep.
but you notice this a pattern.
There's a pattern.
And not only a pattern for yourself,
Yep.
but others who also would be then also indigenous.
Yep.
So there's another sort of dimension to that pattern. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth.
Yeah.
But is that is that something that you observed?
100%.
And if that's something that you're observing, I can't imagine, but there would be this like resentment that starts building up. What I admire about you, Jason, is exactly this part. And I want to get to that, is that a resentment builds up,
Mm-hmm.
an us versus them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's polarizing, man.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to solve that is by building a bridge.
100%.
But that's your mentality.
100%.
But before you get to that part,
Yep.
there is the resentment.
Yep.
There is that oh, now we're on different sides.
Yeah.
And
I
there's a
think
winner and a loser now.
I think it's important that, you have to identify the problem, because there is no fixing a problem unless you identify the problem, first of all. And I think to some degree that has people believing that, I'm an angry Indian. I'm not an angry Indian.
Right.
However,
But did it start at some point in time that you were a little bit unhappy with this?
I think
Who's happy being passed off, not being invited to the game?
right? The frustration for me, and I say this quite
Right.
quite frequently.
I
is
appreciate that honesty.
Yeah,
it's
I
okay to be frustrated, man, because it's
yeah.
frustrating.
But it's like I just the folks that are being disingenuous, but while putting this facade on that they are being honest, is the most troubling aspect of to this whole movement around reconciliation. Like Jody Rayburn Wilson, I sat in on a virtual presentation from her during COVID, and I absolutely loved it. She made mention that she goes, I can honestly, I'd rather work with someone who's truly committed to reconciliation than somebody who's only going halfway, because the ones who are only going halfway are creating more challenges than they are helping, right?
Yeah, like, I mean, this doesn't compare, but like I think of Nelson Mandela being thrown in prison, right?
Mhm.
Like I went to Robben Island.
Yeah.
I walked through there, met like a prisoner who had taken us through the tour. So when I say like these people were in prison,
Yep.
incarcerated, unfairly, tortured,
Yep.
like, right?
Yep.
So what's not natural about being unhappy with that?
Yeah.
It's not right.
No, 100%.
So to start, you start there.
Yeah.
And so you started there.
Yeah.
And you had that. So that's what I want everyone to also appreciate, actually. I think that's what makes you greater even.
Yeah.
That's where you were.
Yeah.
And there is this feeling of like, I want to get justice,
Mhm.
and they ought to pay, right? And we're going to make them pay the eye for the eye.
Yeah.
And the conflict, right? The thought of heading in that direction,
Yeah.
it was present.
Yeah.
And so that's what I wanted to understand, because when you were young,
Yeah.
when we're in our prime and we're strong. You remember those days?
Yeah.
Oh no, you're still great, right? Like I always say, like I'm better now than I've ever been. See, right? But when we were young and we got the energy, we got the zeal, and we're
Yep.
right. The fight is very inviting.
Yep.
I remember.
Yep.
I'd want to fight.
Yep. The fight's getting tiring though.
Well, of course, but you wanted to fight.
Yep.
Yeah, because that's the youth.
Yep.
So you engage in the fight.
Yep.
And that's what I want to get through next, is when you get to that fight and you're in that fight, at some point in time, at what point in time for you did you start saying, there's another way for me to navigate. There's another step. This fight isn't even a fair fight.
Mm-hmm.
Going this route isn't going to get me or anyone to where I want to go.
100%.
When did that start happening?
I think probably it was in my early 30s where I started realizing, I was actually, I was put into a role at that time where I was, handling some Indigenous relations for one of the local forestry companies. And initially on, I was kind of doing what everybody else was doing. Well, let's do a mini powwow, and let's do this, and let's do that, kind of, going to the community and saying, you know what, like, it was really non-effective type things we were doing. I was doing what everybody else was doing.
Feeling like superficial kind
Exactly, right? And now things have changed for me. It's where, like I truly believe that, I have no qualms about identifying a problem, but now my perspective is much different where if I'm gonna challenge a position, then I also got to be willing to prepare a response and a solution. And it may not be the end all be all solution, but it's some place to start, right? Because, as much as people might think that, when you're challenging policy process, that, you're this angry person and not. But I believe in holding people accountable. So if you're sitting there talking about reconciliation this, reconciliation that, and it's all over your website, and you have these goals and targets, you've ultimately told me this is what you're going to do. So what it also signals to me is that why can't I hold you accountable?
Sure.
Like why can't you be accountable to that and doing it in a way that's really professional? Sitting there going, no, I want to do this, but I want to talk to you, right?
So they're right there. There's that saying from I don't know, Einstein or someone. It's like, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results.
100%.
And so you're getting to a point, you're saying now in your 30s, where you're doing the same thing over and over again,
Yep.
and the results they're not coming.
No, 100%.
And so you start, is that it? Like you start
Yeah.
saying, as I said, I got to try a different way.
Yeah.
That's intelligent. Like that's now you're starting to use those higher powers.
Yeah.
And as you started shifting towards that,
Yeah.
you're met with a different set of obstacles.
Yeah.
Because now it's not like the physical thing, or it's not a confrontation.
Yeah.
Because the confrontation, if you go that route, right,
Yeah.
you start navigate. What are the types of challenges then that you found?
I found then that you weren't invited to the tables.
Still,
You weren't at that
even though
time.
you're willing.
Yeah, you still weren't invited to the tables, and that's changed now. It's changed now where we are getting invited to the tables.
So when you weren't invited to the table, what did you do?
Honestly, it was a lot of frustration. So there was a lot of yelling, screaming, pounding on tables, and trying to understand. And I think unfortunately to this day there are still many community leaders that are still not. They're still not at that table yet. They're not
So
seeing.
they're still frustrated.
They're still not seeing themselves at that table.
Right.
Yet you're on the outside, kind of throwing rocks and pounding on the tables outside of that room. But now
How did that change them?
I think it's changed through, like a lot of different organizations, whether it's NACA, the Canadian Council of Indigenous Business, and a lot of leaders before us that have allowed us now to have a seat at that table. So the challenge right now is to encourage more people that have a voice and that have the right intent to get to that table, right? And I can tell you honestly, when I'm speaking at a table and people are asking me to present and sit on panels and present at different conferences and such, I go there from the perspective that I'm speaking for future generations, the 7 generations, the kids that are back home that still may not see a future for them. And the fact that, there was a young lady in one of the northern communities recently that took her life at 10 years old through bullying. But our communities, especially in the far north, still have suicide pacts. And this is 2025. And when people only see suicide and taking their own lives as the way forward, that's a problem. That's a huge problem. In a country that's as rich with resources as Canada is, and the only path forward you see is taking your own life, that has to change. And that's what motivates me is that, I really, to be completely honest with you, I don't have a place in any of my circles that is welcoming to somebody who's self-serving. I don't want it, because at the end of the day, I've witnessed the effects, and I continue to witness the effects on a daily basis of the genocide that was done to our people through residential schools, a 60 scoop. And I witnessed that. And my goal, and what I believe why I was put on this earth, was to help change that, give people hope. And that's what this whole, through our warrior group of companies, is to ignite the warrior within people to say, you deserve to be here just like everybody else. And that's truly what my vision is. Again, like warrior engineering. We never had engineers going up on the res. I don't remember seeing any when we were growing up. We want to change that, and we change it through action, not words. Right? A policy is only as good as the actions that come from it. Right?
100%. So, in sometimes this kind of progress takes, a long, long time.
Yeah.
And you've been able to walk a path with all your frustration and as tired as you might say you're getting.
Yeah.
But look at
Yeah.
what's been covered. Look at the ground that's been covered. And obviously you and a whole bunch of like-minded people,
Yeah.
whether they're from one place or another, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, having to build this together.
Yeah.
That's huge.
100%.
What's been achieved so far.
And having some great allies, trust me, even being here with you and meeting up with you and many other great people out there, right? It's it's interesting because I do a lot of work with Ontario Power Generation, and they invite me to speak quite frequently. And I ask my colleagues at OPG, I'm like, why do you guys keep asking me to come back and speak?
Yeah.
Because there are times where I give you a pat on the back, but I also give you a kick in the butt as well.
Yeah.
And when they told me, a good friend of mine, Allison Bradley, goes, you know what, Jay, you're honest.
Yeah.
She goes, and you're going to give it to us straight, and we learn that way. And I love that. Like they're my friends. Like we have discussions and good discussions, right? And things may not be moving as fast as I wish they would, but they're moving forward.
But I
right?
think one of the things is very effective, and it's not just been done with, I don't just see you doing it, but anyone who is effective in this type of challenge is staying kind.
Yep.
Honest is good.
Yep.
But we're human beings, and you've studied this, and
Yep.
you know that is the ultimate, right? Like that is the bridge builder, kindness. Yep. And for a person who's experienced cruelty,
Yep.
to be kind, right? I feel like that requires a lot of strength.
Yep.
What do you say to yourself to stay kind?
I've always said, it costs you $0 to be a respectful human being. And I don't mean to salt of the earth, right? Treat people with respect. It doesn't cost you a dime. You be a good person. And, I was very fortunate that, my parents really instilled some great moral values within me. They've been married 50 years. Celebrated their 50th anniversary in December of 2023. Very proud to say that. But, I'm still the person. You hold the door open for, the ladies. You take your hat off at dinner, and try to instill that within my kids. And that's just who I am. That's a part of the skills.
I don't know about that. That's who you are. I think that's a choice.
Yeah.
I think that's a choice. You can make that choice any day not to be kind. And it's not like that temptation doesn't knock on your door. To really stick it to someone.
Yeah.
And you choose not to.
Because it doesn't serve you.
Well, say that, there you go. And you've got the higher purpose.
Yep.
I feel like there's so much more still yet for us to talk about.
Yeah.
But really, essentially, the beginning of it all for me is the young boy,
Yep.
the young man who experiences, cruelty, who experiences, injustice, who experiences this. And this is not just, let's just say, perception or anger talking.
Yeah.
It's real.
100%.
And not having yet got his justice for himself.
Yeah.
It converts and channels that to let's go make this different and better for the ones coming up the path.
100%.
When you look at the path now that's being laid, right? That you've built, as much as it's not perfect, right? It's still being paved.
Yeah.
There are young Indigenous boys and girls,
Yep.
men and women also, that are very frustrated,
Yep.
that are banging on the table and not getting invited still.
Yep.
It happens.
Yep.
You could tell them rise.
Yep.
But how do you tell them to stay kind and stay committed because that's been how you've been victorious.
Yeah.
How do you get that across?
I think ultimately it's being willing, having that willingness to share, mentor, give people an ear, right? And that's the important aspect of things is, what you get from me, what you see is what you get. This is me. I don't care if I'm talking to the CEO of Atkins Realis, or I'm talking to, a homeless man from whatever community on the street. This is what you get. And at the end of the day, it's more so around giving people that time and space, right? I do a lot of that. I try to, when people ask, as an example, Initiative Employment and Training is doing an Indigenous entrepreneurs program. Will you come and speak? 100%. I will make my time. I'm not getting paid for it. I'll go make my time because I've been there. I know that.
But for these people who have to go between, say, patience and persistence, to don't give up on it, because there's this feeling of, after a little while of frustration, just you throw your hands up. What do you tell them to keep going?
Just sharing that journey, sharing, the good, the bad, and the ugly within it. I think just trying to be very transparent, being very honest, and trying to be that helping hand, right? And giving people that voice, right? And I think that's, as an example, my community back home of Red Rock, I started a group of just community member-owned businesses, members of the community that are maybe managing community-owned businesses, just to give them a voice and to advocate for each other, right? Letting them know that you're not on an island. We all have challenges, and just through those actions and simply connecting people, like, oh, I didn't know you had a business, and now our members within our little group here, there's nothing official to our group, but we're doing business together within this collective, right? And for me, that's like perfect. That's a win, right?
And in order for this, this shared, I don't even call it coexistence. I want to call it harmony. That I think on some level we all seek.
Yeah.
Indigenous, non-Indigenous.
Yeah.
What do you say to now also a non-Indigenous person who is, who's saying, like, listen, I'm trying to understand. But I feel like I'm being treated like a bad guy here.
Yeah.
And I'm not being appreciated for, like, the effort I'm making. And they're frustrated on that side as well.
Yeah.
And I don't like calling it sides, but at the end of the day, that's what it seems, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And so to bring the sides together,
Yep.
right? Like, I think that the message to an Indigenous people is about, man, your kindness is your greatest weapon. But then it's also the same time, they've welcomed people before, and they've been kind, and
It's worked out.
it didn't work out so well from what the stories get told.
Yeah.
Right. So that level of that's a tough one, I feel.
I think though it all boils down to, at the end of the day, relationships, right? And building upon that relationship where, we, through our cultural awareness program, Christine Bakar from our team developed this program that she delivers right across the nation. And the cornerstone to all this is the part of the program is called the Guiding Principles. And it truly is about relationship building and getting to know somebody, getting to understand, the community or whoever you're working with, the organization, and going in there. But you can't go in there with the mentality. And I find this happens quite often, especially with non-Indigenous organizations trying to work with Indigenous groups, is that they come in with this savior mentality. And that's not a great way to start, right? We don't need a savior. We don't need someone to ride in on this white horse and save the community. We don't need it. We need to develop that relationship and have an understanding of what are some of the challenges, what's going on in your community, and how do we support each other? Because that's empowerment. If I can get the skills, you can help me obtain the skills to be self-sufficient so that I'm building and growing and not dependent. Because what colonization has created for us, unfortunately, and what has been, a huge part of where we're at and the challenges we're facing now is this perspective of dependency on the government.
Mm.
And that has to change. Like, we don't need to be dependent on anybody. Finding that confidence again, finding that inner warrior is what's required, right? And having that feeling of accomplishment. That's what I tell people. I say, I'm not looking for a handout. I'm looking for an opportunity, because within that opportunity, I'm building skills and I'm building confidence, right? And unfortunately, to this day, I say this quite frequently, is that, we built teams from within our companies that, to some degree, we're sitting on the bench. We got our skates tied, our helmets on, waiting for the coach to tap us in the game. That tap to get in the game is not happening enough, right? Because being tapped into the game and showing people what you can do introduces people to new opportunities, new markets, new business sectors. As is an example, like Warrior Engineering was the first Indigenous approved vendor for OPG nuclear, right? And now we're seeing where nuclear is going. And if you can get some allies within that, will help grow the community, and it helps builds the sector. It helps, move our economy. It helps us as Indigenous people prosper, right? And that's how I think. That's what motivates me. That's what I share within my peers, and people that want to have a conversation about what's the path forward. That is the path forward, right? And I think more of that has to happen. I kind of use the same mentality when it comes to my background is also in health and safety, but the same premise applies to Indigenous inclusion and reconciliation. It's like when you're focused on safety, you don't just hit a safety milestone and say, I'm done. That's it. I'm not gonna work safely the rest of the year. We're good. You keep going. Safety is a part of every day. Reconciliation in that messaging needs to be every day. It's like, no, how do we improve? How do we get better, right? Because like you were talking about earlier, like this vision of living in harmony where we're all prospering and not sitting there pointing fingers at someone who's living in tent city and say, oh, they're less than me. No, they're not. I'm sure that person that's in that tent city had dreams and aspirations, and when their parents were coddling them as young folks,
Yeah, very
they
cool.
never had a vision of them living in a tent and dealing with mental health or addictions issues, right? Unfortunately, through the history of residential school and the 60s scoop and being swept out of your parents' arms, we're dealing with those traumas today. And that's a reality. You can't look past that. You can't just forget it. That's a part of what we're dealing with every day, right? But the next generation and, the passing of Justice Murray Sinclair and the work he's done will never be lost, because what he said was the truth. But it's up to us now also as Indigenous folks to start being leaders. And unfortunately, we've adopted this perspective of waiting for the government, industry, municipalities to dictate the rules of engagement. I'm like, no, we develop the rules of engagement. We go on the offensive and build something that, developers, industry, whatever the case may be, comes to us, and we work on something that's a mutual benefit,
Thank you,
right?
Jason. That's you know, to like I was saying to you earlier, there's a lot for us to cover, and I feel like we're gonna talk again
Yeah, for
because
sure.
each one of these have a whole lot of context that also still needs to come out.
Absolutely.
But thank you for today.
Sure.
Thank you for
My
taking
pleasure.
that first step with me. I really appreciate you coming all the way here, sharing from the childhood to the young man to the adult.